If you're wondering if you're in the right room and whether you read it correctly, it's true. We are talking about a very, very interesting topic today, and we titled it "From Guns and Gangs to Cults and Cats: The Importance of Deeply Understanding the Ever-Growing Complex Needs of Your Community." And trust me, there's a story behind everything. So I'm gonna share some stories from the field a little bit. I'm of course gonna need to share some data because it wouldn't be a HelpSeeker webinar without some data drops and some technology talk. But I think there's so much richness in what we're learning in the communities. I'm gonna try to do it justice at the same time as giving you guys some tools and ideas about how this can all apply in your community context as well. Some of the strategies that we're learning about and some of the trends we're seeing on the ground as well. So I'm very excited for it. With that being said, wanted to acknowledge all of us gathering here from across Turtle Island. For us, we're a settler organization, and what that means is that we work in and with Indigenous communities and people, but we're not ourselves an Indigenous organization. So I myself am not Indigenous to Canada. Some might say I'm Indigenous to Romania, which is where I came from. And I was lucky enough to be one of the folks that was accepted in this country as a refugee over 20 years ago, and learned so much since about this country and its peoples and its First Peoples. So that work continues for me, learning more, doing better all the time. We commit ourselves as an organization to acknowledging that some of the systems that we work in and with are part of colonial apparatuses. So it behooves us to, as we work in them, to shed light on these issues. And when we have data about this, bring the data forward. Etc. So again, I'll share some stories about this as we go through the presentation as well. So with that being said, a little bit about HelpSeeker, and when I say a little, this is it. So we do data, we do software, and we do strategy, and we do that for folks that are innovators on the front lines of solving the world's most complex social challenges. And while there's lots of folks doing this in the commercial sphere, in the business sphere, we feel that some of the most innovative ideas and complex issues that exist are actually happen to be in the social safety net. So we are solely focused on helping the transformation of that social safety net into something better. Do we always know what that better is? I think we're getting a pretty good idea the more we learn, but we're definitely a work in progress ourselves. So with that being said, I wanted to start for a hot second with this whole concept of what is the data telling us. And with cats, cults, guns, gangs, this is all a synthesis of trends or issues or areas of concern that emerge as you gather data about your community. So none of these things in and of themselves just pop up. There's usually some signals in your community that these issues are emergent. And sometimes it's because your friend next door that's also managing social planning or is delivering programs has alerted you to it, or it's webinars like this where you're starting to see what other experiences might be happening across the country to look at your own community in a new light. But with that being said, around what the data is telling us, I think the big question before we get into too much technicality is what exactly are we talking about when we say data? And all data is information about something. It doesn't in and of itself give you any insights about why this matters or what you should do with this information. And data itself comes in a billion different formats. So it can be your one-on-one conversation with somebody with lived experience. That's that qualitative data, that richness, the census you use to collect information. You're collecting data and you're processing that data into insights and actions. That's data as much as statistics is data. And arguably, lived experience is probably going to be a better bet. But at the same time, corroborating data across different sources is also really important. And the reason we want to be doing that is because data is and what it's telling us is very complex. And that's because the environments that we live in are very complex themselves. And again, I don't need to tell you about how everything is connected, of course, so we can make a case for everything being connected and connecting the dots, but explaining the connection is much more difficult. And we see this in machine learning all the time. Well, the machine learning algorithm will be applied to a bunch of data and it'll spit out a top 10 factors that are impacting, let's say, homelessness or domestic violence. But the machine learning algorithm can explain why these things are connected, right? So we don't get that information that then we can use to design interventions or design policies that are different. And so that's why that local context and corroborating evidence is so critical. And so for us at HelpSeeker, at least, we think about open data. So what are the data sets that are out there floating around, as you will? Sometimes they're websites, so you can get a bunch of information about what's happening in a community from websites. Sometimes it's the census, which is a huge resource for communities. And it's a whole range of quality of that data. So you can have a really tiny data set that doesn't tell you very much, and you can have a big data set that is really informative when you're looking at comparisons. But open data for sure is one area that you want to be looking at to understand complex needs in your community. And you need to inventory that data, you need to analyze that data, you need to layer it upon each other to see what it's telling you. That community data as well. So the reports, the policies, the relationships, the supply in your community. What is your community data telling you? And it's going to be very different than what you might read in a census report, of course, because it's going to have the lens of your community context. And sometimes that's a really tough one to replicate, to get replicable statistics about it, because it's much more localized, obviously, but also really important. And then the last piece, which is, like I said, probably the most important one, and really, what is community data and open data if not a roll-up of living experiences and living experience voices? And we always say this is data, don't look at it as just numbers, look at it as representing people. I think we often forget about that the living experiences are the source, right? That's the source of where these various data sets are produced from. And so triangulating the open data, which is almost a downstream data set, the community data, and with the living experiences becomes so essential. So what we get out of this is, okay, we've got a lot of information, we can see a lot of dots connecting, but do we actually understand much about how these things come together, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do with this webinar is to show you that making the connections or connecting the dots using available data sets can shed really interesting lights on some of these complex issues. And you might uncover things like cults, things like gangs. You might also uncover connections between them as well. So with that, let's get into how might we connect the dots. So I'm gonna say a couple stories here, and I'm gonna look at my time, make sure I'm good, because I do want to get to some of the more technical, how do you do this stuff as well. But I do have some time to tell you some stories about cats. So in the homelessness world, homelessness sector, we often talk about enumeration and understanding trends and demographics, and we talk about that on a point-in-time basis. So if folks are familiar with the point-in-time homeless count, that's a really interesting example of enumeration. We've been thinking a lot about how we get that to be much more real-time and more sophisticated, but one of the things that's really challenged our methodology has been through some of the partnerships we have with, for instance, Humane Society, that's looking at the flow of food resources in shelters. So for folks that might be experiencing homelessness that have pets, and how do we ensure that we have adequate resources in the shelter in terms of pet food as well? And are those shelters or food bank services able to augment their offerings at a national level to support the needs of pets of folks that are experiencing homelessness. You're in the sector, I don't need to explain to you how critical these companions are to folks that are experiencing homelessness or in poverty or experiencing disabilities. This is not a pet, it's so much more than that. So a really important part of their well-being. One of the things that we realized in one of our communities, and I have two stories about cats, is this was pre-COVID, and it was in the community of Lethbridge. And again, there was nothing in the open data or even in the living experiences interviews. And we talked to about 3,000 people through those circle dialogues and so on. So in a community of 100,000. But what came up in the community data was that the number one concern for this community that was not in the usual category, so not your typical mental health and addictions, etc., but it ranked quite high comparatively, was stray cats. And it was just one of those, it seemed random to us at the time, right? We didn't understand what the connection was, but it always stuck with me that you should always be understanding it from the horse's mouth, if you will. And so it stuck with me because it came up again in a different community in Ontario, and this is post-COVID, and what's been happening in this community, and I don't know if it's a national trend yet because it's just emergent, is that folks are abandoning their pets. There was pets that were bought during COVID as companion pets. I mean, we were definitely those people that bought a dog. That was way too, she's a lot. Her name's Petunia, and she's a lot. But the question becomes, are these trends that stick out in other communities as well? So this is one that we've been watching. The Humane Society in this community has raised a red flag and said this is abnormal. This is out of the norm, and it's almost entire colonies of these abandoned pets that are. And I come from Romania, so we had abandoned pets that would roam the urban environment all the time. And what do we do about that? What is it signaling? What's happening in the community that this is now a trend? And then obviously, how do we address it as well? So that's one dot. The other one that we also notice, and this is in a yet different community. This one didn't come from open data, didn't come from community data. This one came from living experiences. This came from field work, from being there on the ground with the community, going to observe, participant observation. If you're familiar with the ethnographic method, we totally love this piece of the work because you always learn so much more. That local context and flavor is so essential to understanding what's going on. But as we were having the team work through in the field, one of the things that emerged is, and you kind of pick up on it in different contexts. In one context, it's like, oh, there's some new folks moving in. We don't have folks moving in this community. It's a really small community. We usually know everybody, and we've seen, our population isn't really growing. If anything, folks are moving away because people are aging and they're selling off their farms, etc. But most recently, there's folks that are buying up a lot of land, and so then that gives you a clue that there's a signal, right? Communities are talking about it, so you can go to the open data and take a look. Land purchase, right? And then you start realizing, oh, this is not 20 different people. This is only one corporation or one numbered company, and then you can pull the records to understand who owns that, who are the shareholders in that company, and that gives you names, right? That gives you people's names as well. And then you can Google those names, right? And start to understand what's happening. And then you can go back to the community and say, well, does this give you any insights as folks that are living here? Well, needless to say, this is an alleged cult, and we don't, again, this is what the community is telling us, and what the leading expert on cults in Canada is telling us from the University of Alberta, is that there's a strategy whereby a cult community will move into a community and systematically start kind of taking over control of that community by, for instance, becoming elected to the school board, becoming elected to to the council, the town council, and slowly, you've kind of lost control of that over that community, and it's moving, right? They're moving because sometimes communities catch on to this, and alarm bells will be raised. But again, something like that, for us to be able to raise the alarm bell on this with our community partner early while it's happening is so essential. The next one is illegal guns. And again, this is not a new issue. This is not a new issue. So I'm by no means telling you that it is, but it's an issue that is gaining major traction. And the reason for that is that, well, number one, open data is telling us that these are challenges that are pervading Canadian cities, from the biggest ones to quite small ones. So there's a city of 14,000 people that has one of the highest crime rates due to violence, and obviously we know that illegal guns are also connected to changing gangs, and how gangs are also shifting how they do business as well, and how in one community we're doing a bunch of work on technology leverage points, and how that's shifting gang practices. And the usual ways that we used to move the illegal wares, and I'm unfortunately having to refer not just to guns, but to people and organs as well, is shifting, and it's facilitated in very novel ways by technology, to the point where people talk about the Uberification of gangs, and how some of the business relationships amongst the bigger players have become so much more cordial, if you will. So gangs becoming, let's not compete. There's lots of room for both of us. So they will even share the same runners, right? The same mules. The same mule will receive a notice to do a run for one gang, and then the next it'll be another gang. And that's, again, through the beauty of technology, right? We've completely changed how gangs function. So obviously there's a connection here, right? And sorry about that. So how are these all connected? And we can talk about the connection between stray cats and cults and illegal guns and changing gangs at a hypothetical level. We all know that these are social challenges, but more specifically, what might be connecting these at a more current, what's happening in the environment today type of way. And one of the things that is definitely underpinning some of these shifts is we know that the COVID effects have really shifted how society is operating worldwide. So we know that some of these networks of moving guns and moving drugs have shifted because of technology as well. And when COVID disrupted the gang and illegal gun trade, they were also in some ways forcing that technological adoption and innovation much faster in this sector than some of us that maybe didn't have the same commercial pressures to run things under the radar in the same way. Obviously, we don't do that. So what we're hearing from folks on the ground that are in the enforcement area is that, the shift facilitated by technology has completely changed the game, and it's changing it at a much faster rate than some of our safety initiatives have been able to catch up to, right? So we know this all too well. COVID then was a major precipitator. The other precipitator here is that COVID also threw us into a recessionary inflation, which is really unique. But what that means is that we actually see increasing demand for cheaper types of drugs, and we saw this in the last recession as well, after the big recession, the housing crisis, where communities again were seeing racialized communities, marginalized populations, newcomers specifically under pressure. And suddenly the moving something on the side while you're doing your day-to-day job is not that unreasonable anymore. So that economic pressure where people would normally not touch the informal sector, the illegal economy, that pressure on housing costs, on food costs is moving. And again, this is what we're hearing from the ground up, not in the data, because the data is unfortunately too darn old. to tell us this, but we're seeing it in the community data and in the living experiences that people are getting attracted to this. It's the value, the risk proposition makes sense now because of those pressures. And then the stray cats, I mean, doesn't take 2 and 2 to say, when you can't afford to feed yourself, you're not going to be able to afford your cat either. So those are some of the connections that we see. On the other side, we also know that when we dig deeper into these, and these should never be taken at face value, you want to corroborate this. You want to be understanding that there's a connection between these big 4 higher level social challenges, but at the local level, we also know that there's certain connections too. So stray cats are precipitated when you have a combination of unoccupied buildings, when you've got poor waste management in a particular neighborhood or area, when you've got a lack of community awareness that this is even an issue, perhaps a spay and neuter programs that are not affordable or you don't have any. And then the abandonment of cats, which is, again, why would somebody abandon a cat? Aging population will definitely do it as well as people increase their ability to, or decrease their ability to care for themselves and caring for a pet on top of low income. This is totally makes sense why these would converge in a particular community. So we understand that, or we can dig deeper into it rather. When it comes to cults, we know a societal upheaval, which we're still going through. We've got economic distress, we got weak community institutions, we got a lack of education around what a cult looks like and why it's a problem. Social isolation, right? So that the recruitment goes much easier when you've got all of these elements going in. And of course, when you connect the dots, you've got a perfect recipe for a vulnerable community as well. So again, be aware of these connections. And then almost last but not least, these are going to go faster because we already talked about them. But again, we're talking about high crime rates, poverty, easy access to guns, which is influenced by public policy as well, drug trafficking and gang activity. So all of these dots become connected when it comes to the gangs as well. So those spell for us, at least, the need to do these social needs assessments like no one's business. Oh, perfect timing. Look at that. 2 minutes to spare. So let me just check my chat before I go into the next one. Yeah, we're good, except for Travis, who says, too slow, Alina, too slow, but it's okay. Now I'm going to get technical. So that's all stories. These are stories from the field and stories from the data. How do we actually get on top of this? And lots of communities and lots of organizations undertake social needs assessments. And what exactly are we talking about when we say that? It's just. It's a systematic process for identifying and evaluating these social needs. They might be in a community, in a specific group, population, etc. And the whole purpose here is to identify needs and determine what interventions. They might be policies, services, resources, new partnerships. How are you going to address these challenges? So it's always what do you have? What do you need? How do you pay for it? In a way, conversation that we've had with you before. And of course, it's never that simple, right? So here's the complexity of the task at hand. It's not that simple to calibrate complex social problems. I know people and sometimes politicians are, you just got to do this one thing and it's all solved. But as we know, in practice and in the real world, where we live this stuff day to day, it's really complicated. There's so much politics. There's so many connections, so many feedback loops. You're almost paralyzed by the complexity sometimes. And you've got your supply factors, the various levels of government, charities, social policies, financials, frontline workers, are all of us that are in the supply of the social safety net are involved in the provision of it. And I'm not just talking about service providers per se, they're part of it, but policies are a part of understanding the supply, because policies interact and intersect with service delivery clearly and funding flows. So it's not good enough to just look at services. You got to understand the complexity a little bit better. And then demand. And of course, we like to, let's keep it simple. Let's just focus on this, on pets. and animals that are homeless. Let's just focus on that. But as we just talked about, everything's connected. So, you introduce an intervention on one part and suddenly it creates these ripple effects downstream that, you try to calibrate something for pets and you just created yourself a complete neighborhood surveillance challenge in invisible minority populations, because you didn't understand that abandonment is connected to marginalization and racialized poverty, for instance, and you started sending lots of uniforms in a particular neighborhood without putting two and two together. What happens all the time between land use bylaw and social development departments and municipalities is a great example. So the question is, how do you calibrate amidst complexity? And for us, at least, and for me personally, network theory has been really, really useful as a frame. And the reason for that is because network theory, just to keep it super simple, talks about interdependence and talks about looking at these connections and these ripple effects and embracement of complexity, if that's a word. But the big learning and takeaway for me is that changes in one part of the system will have ripple effects through the entire system. And it's overwhelming sometimes, I know, to think ahead and look at these, but that is exactly what we need to be doing so that we can at least process or put ourselves in that thinking space of what might be, right? What might be the interdependence here? What might be the network effects? What might be the changes and unintended consequences? We talk about it, we hardly ever do it in practice. So here's an example, and we use the subway system only because it seems so simple and it's not that simple in practice. So social needs assessment comes up with the need for better transportation options, more efficient and cheaper, affordable transportation options. One of the recommendations in the social needs assessment is we need to double down on our investment in the subway line, and Calgary is a really great example of it. But we tend to stop there, right? So when you increase supply, and the quality of the supply is better, and you're advertising that supply to ridership to get ridership up, because you got to justify your expenditures, the demand might go up, right? So you've now introduced a new element, and that element might be better than the bus system. So fewer people might be using the buses because pretty logical next step. That will, of course, change land use and development patterns as well. That in turn might increase demand for particular types of housing, which in turn, as you bring new people into certain communities, might increase demand for childcare. And that in turn might change crime patterns. So kind of thinking downstream about the social impacts of a decision just in that one line is interesting. But let's go up. So with this concept of changing land use development, you might have a fork, right? You might see that you've now created the land use conditions for increasing population density. That in turn will diversify your population. So you're going to have more variety of people moving into the city because you've changed the types of zoning and the types of housing offerings and housing prices that you're going to be able to provide. That might drive your economic growth. But let's be honest, majority of our Canadian growth is going to be coming from newcomer communities. So that multi-language service delivery aspect should be thought about as well. So it's not just about increasing investment in the subway. What else should we be thinking about? And I'm not saying start doubling down on multi-language service delivery today, but can we make these connections and can we think like this? Again, moving upstream, increasing house prices. When you have more people moving in, costs go up, the land value goes up. So income inequality is often associated with that, and changing family structures once again. So these all, of course, they look so linear, but again, they're actually a network with network effects and complex feedback loops. So how do we actually get at this? How do we understand all of it? What we're seeing and what we hypothesize is that we've really outgrown the good old single issue needs assessment. We've outgrown the report needs assessment, but for some reason we still love them. So, and I personally do love writing myself a needs assessment because it makes me process this information in a new way. but the data I'm using to write my needs assessment has to change. So I still need to write my needs assessment, that narrative, the explanation, the making the connection. That's where we get the value. That's where we get the ideas and solutions, that creative thinking. However, the data that we're using and the techniques we're applying to the data are pretty outdated. So how do we deconstruct that needs assessment so that we can make it more, I don't want to call it modern, but au courant, if you will, more of the day. So we've deconstructed these, and this is how we think about them. Take it if it's useful, take it as a framework or not. Again, going back to the supply-demand calibration theme, which is, we're a little obsessed about that. The supply of policy and actors, so finding ways to do that smarter through this concept of network theory and complexity. Financial mapping, you've seen us in the media. I don't need to tell you how passionate we are about money in the system and understanding how resources flow. Supply mapping, who's doing what services, what programs, the bread and butter for systems mapping when we started out as a company. Capacity analysis, that's cool. You've got 200 organizations. What's their bottlenecks and where are the bottlenecks? Network mapping, how are people, organizations, information connected to each other? So the actual mapping of the complexity. Demand, social data trends. We talked about the census. I'll bring it up again. It's basic table stakes, but there's about at least another 20 data sets that you should be thinking about, including the Canada Revenue Agency, as well as the victimization social survey. There's so much. Community input and design, so that local community data as well as the qualitative information. Demand calculation, so planning for the future, like I talked about with the subway line, planning scenarios and unintended consequences. Those concepts are critical. And well-being measurement as well at regular intervals, so that you have comparative, comprehensive data that you can cross-reference. Investment modeling, where do we best leverage our funding to make the most impact, knowing that this is some of the potential pitfalls from our scenario modeling. And calibration, how do we turn this all into strategy at the GR level, government relations level, at the investment level, funders, which are not necessarily the same as government, but related, as we all know, operational level and tactical level. So all of that begs for knowledge translation mechanisms. So the way we used to do things, which was the big report and the presentation to council usually, or to our boards, think differently. Think how you might do it in a creative way so that you don't put all this time and this amazing needs assessment and then it sits on a shelf and the community doesn't get the network benefit of your investment in this work. So think about what websites you can develop for target audiences that, let's say, the neighborhoods that might be experiencing risk. What about interactive reports, infographics, and briefing notes to different levels of government, different departments within the municipality, so that land use is aware that this might be occurring. Connecting the dots and doing that through some of the knowledge translation is amazing, an amazing thing to do. So just to give you some ideas around supply mapping, and again, to define it quickly, this is just a visualization, mapping and visualization of the network of orgs, programs, services available in your social infrastructure, very table stakes. So key questions might be, what organizations exist? What are their unique program offerings? Do they share that similar footprint? Who are the outliers, etc.? I'll show you an example of it, but just to be aware, and this is just our learnings, be aware of single issue mapping. So I talked about homeless pets, for instance. Careful with being way too focused without understanding the big picture, because all of these things are so entwined. So narrowly focusing on these is a risk to be aware of. Another risk is categorizing as you go, where you start, I'm just going to start collecting data. I'm just going to start. And then you start getting this data and you look at it and you're like, I actually have no categorization methodology. I have no idea if this is this kind of a program or this kind of a program, or if this is this kind of population or this. So do your taxonomy first, do your ontology, do your taxonomy first, which is all to say, have a way to classify it ahead of time so that you're not collecting data willy-nilly and then trying to make sense of it after, because then you're going to have to potentially redo it, and have been there personally. So learn from my mistakes. And then mapping without precision. So not going deep enough to actually answer your business questions, making sure that you collect the right level of information. To give you an illustration of this, here's food and nutrition. These are 8 communities, 8 entities that are providing access to food and nutrition. There's 8 that are doing food and nutrition. 6 of them are doing access. You can see 3 are doing education, 3 are addressing insecurity, and 1 is more general. Well, these are, when we look at the types of programs they are, you can see they're all community programs. 4 of them we know are charitable. 4 of them are also general. We can cross tab these, but just to give an idea, what I wanted to show you though, is that you can also see more specifically the types of community program services that are being provided. So are we talking about, giving somebody kind of general, general food in an emergency food context? Are we talking about a soup kitchen? Are we talking about fresh food box? Exactly what is being supplied is the point of precision, because then you can calculate the demand. This is an interesting one on the supply mapping with precision point. Lots of us probably feel like we know how many organizations are in our community. We probably interact with them all the time. This actually slide is from an example of a community. And what we actually did is took a look at their compared this community in terms of its program to organization ratio against other communities as well, and realized like, wow, the average organization ratio in the comparative communities is 3.85. But in this one community, you can see it's there's some that are way, way higher than others. So lots of these insights are of major value, because what you're realizing is, let's say in a community of 140,000 people, you can have 225 organizations delivering, and that you might feel like you know who they are, but you're probably not going to have in your head all the thousands of programs and all the thousands of services that they may be providing, because those are changing quite a bit as well. The other value is that when we group these programs and then dissect them from the organization, we actually see completely different patterns of commonality. So just because an organization says that they do poverty, they can have programs that have potentially nothing to do with poverty at the same time. There might be some tangential connection there, but not necessarily. So here you're looking at Strathmore's, just one of our beta communities where we're testing some of these new techniques out. These are children's programs in Strathmore, and these are the programs. When we actually dig into them, we see some, well, now, number one, you can see the ones that are clustering according to some themes here, but there's certainly ones that are that were surprising to us that we didn't realize would pop up in the children and as a children program, but they described doing work for children, but it was in an organization that didn't describe itself as having that focus. So digging into programs is really critical. It also lets you narrow in on certain aspects and the unique mix of services in a community. And once you understand that, you can start to see misalignments. So in this case, we can understand, for instance, that back to the food example, when we want to understand communities that might be providing basic needs and food services for kids, there's actually only one, and it's this one, this Wheatland Food Bank. So it's not like there's an overwhelming, oversupply of these services, and it's not like they're specifically targeting schools or anything like that. So it gives the community some sense, and the reason why food is a key one is because I believe, if I'm not misquoting here, 8% of students in Strathmore schools talk about being hungry at school. In the needs assessment, it popped up. So we were like, well, are we doing anything in schools for this? And the answer is, maybe we need to look into that a little bit more. So getting more precise. Comparing this to the social trends, and we always laugh about the census. It's like everybody knows we should be looking at the census, The census just dumped all of the census data in December on us. And first I was kind of annoyed by it, because I knew I'd have to do so much work to understand it. And then I got into it, and then I'm obsessed. Like you guys, I'm obsessed with the census data because it's so rich when you layer it in on top of all this stuff. So things that are so basic that we forget to do the work on it, you get so much value there. So let's give an example from a community we're working with. And sorry, we had to anonymize some of this stuff, but I think you get it. Higher than average number of households with kids between ages 1 to 5, lowest percentage of one-person households in the country. So not a lot of lone parents, but lots of young kids. Okay. Large proportion of population are childbearing age. So, okay. Cool. Why do we care about this? Well, community A, when you look at all those factors, and plus a couple more that we don't have time to get into, this community is about to blow up in terms of its natural population growth. And this is actually a community we work with the health system on. And we're like, are we on the right track? Like, is the census suggesting that you're about to have a lot of babies in this community? And like, oh no, we're already seeing it. That totally makes sense. So we know this is going to happen. And of course, when you have lots of kids, you already have higher than average number of kids. You already have people coupling up and having babies. And then we looked at and said, are we ready for this? Is this community ready for this? Only 5% of their social infrastructure was providing child and family specific supports. But this is like the single greatest growth area and demand that we were actually, besides settlement services, which you can probably guess that majority of their growth was coming from newcomer communities in this community, and they had almost non-existent newcomer supports. So it becomes pretty obvious, right, that we need urgent investment in these areas. So don't underestimate the social data trends you're going to get from census. And the other cool thing about the census is you can actually put that on a map and people get it. Hopefully, maybe you can tell which community this is if you're familiar, if anybody's here from Ontario. But here's the community, and on the left-hand side, the cool part about the census is you can drill really deep. So you can see visible minorities as percent of population. You can have lots of measures. The cool part is you can do this comparison. And here's the core housing need of the population. And then you can see the darker the color, the more of it is. When you layer them on top of each other, though, you can see in this kind of really dark spot that those are areas where you have high visible minority and high core housing need. Okay, interesting. And of course, it kind of goes down from there in terms of the coincidence of these factors. But good to know. What's interesting here is when we plot on top of this, the proximity to services that we mapped in the supply map relative to these renters of the population, it gives us some interesting clues about potentially where demand might be more acute. So we know that there's a relationship between renting and being a newcomer to Canada. We tend to rent, one of those things, and our path to home ownership is not always quick, especially nowadays. So having that sense of proximity to social supports is also essential to this population, but also renters in general. We know that they tend to be lower income and have higher proportion of core housing need. So lots of reasons to be thinking about renters as percentage of the population. Lots of reasons to think about proximity, accessibility, walkability to services. So what you've got on the left-hand side, light means it's far. Dark green means it's close proximity. So you can see like quite a few are in close proximity to these neighborhoods. This is the highway actually going through the town. When we look at the renters, we can see, again, dark means more renters, lighter means less renters. So, not too bad, but let's put them together. So again, dark means we've got good proximity to services, and we got lots of renters. So you want that coincidence. You want lots of dark. It means there's a match. But check out the ones that are circled in yellow. That's where we've got lots of renters and basically nothing in sight, right? So is that potentially, if you're going to be investing in anything new, is this an area that we might want to explore or maybe dig deeper with our lived experience circles or community dialogues, etc. So that's how you can use this data. And then the last one I'll mention, and then I'll leave 10 minutes for questions, is to map the experiences of people. So remember, we always talk about lived and living experiences, stakeholder interviews, and kind of those deep dives with folks that are experiencing these systems. So doing those journey maps and using that as data itself to map against your supply becomes really interesting. So this is a use case of Anita, 41-year-old woman living in Barrie, immigrated from the Caribbean, 3-month-old baby, works full-time, takes the family car during the day, leaves her alone to take care of the baby at home. So lots of stuff going on there too. Postpartum depression, needs mental health. She wants to be part of a group setting, connect with other folks, worried about not being able to pay bills because her partner's wages are barely covering the cost of living. So here's some of the aspects of her identity. She was also an athlete that hasn't been able to keep that up, but still identifies as much more than her job and much more than being a mom. She's got interests. She's got things she's proud of. And so these would be the organizations offering products and services that she would probably be really interested in. So her goals are to find and attend mental health support group for new moms, locate a rent supplement, find short-term childcare while she seeks out these supports as a way to make sure she can pick up her baby on time at the end of the day. Not a lot to ask for, right? Well, here's the touch points that she would need to have in a day's time in this particular ecosystem, in the Barrie ecosystem, for her to be able to do that. So we're making some assumptions here in the model around weather, program availability, physical ability, her access to phone and internet, et cetera. We know those can be barriers as well. But when we trace her journey through the system, we can actually start to identify what she would be eligible for out of that entire supply map. What's interesting is there's only one program that actually has some of these elements. And so it becomes pretty obvious, that there's much more of those types of programs we might need, but also think about the number of barriers, because every time you switch programs, it's barrier, right? It's context switching, never mind the barriers of getting to and from places. It's a huge amount of time to do that. So that's what eats up. It costs a lot of time to be poor, right? It costs a lot of time to use our social safety net effectively. And we want her time spent elsewhere. This is the taking it to the last level, my favorite level, which is the systems. So how do you roll this up? And this is just a screenshot here about how you might do this network analysis at the scale of systems to understand the flow of humans, of information, of money at that network analysis level to roll up into your strategy as well. So this is kind of like, we can't get into it too much. All that to say, with all this technology underway, I thought our next chat should pick up on this theme of networks and pick up on the theme of new technologies and how they're changing the game and posing some really interesting challenges, ethical challenges, the future of the workforce types of challenges, and lots of worry in the tech sector for sure on what this ChatGPT means. If anybody hasn't looked up ChatGPT, give it a Google and try it out. In fact, I challenge you to try it out so that when you come to the webinar, you're going to be able to ask some interesting questions. But it's disrupting everything right now, and it actually only came out about 2 weeks ago. And I think, or at least I knew about it 2 weeks ago. I tried it out. I'm like, oh, this is like so much better than some of the other AI tools that we use for like checking spelling or like finding better ways of writing things in simpler language. AI is really, really great for that. But ChatGPT takes it to a whole nother level. It can start to make connections between things. So it's been really cool. So really good for summarizing like high level stuff and kind of like pulling some, like a better way to Google is one way to describe it, but it's got tons and tons of implications for us. And it's completely upending the social sector right now. So had so many conversations in the last week that I just want to like articulate them to you guys and have the conversation with you. This is going to be on April 27, same time as today, 10 a.m. And I'm sorry it's kind of far. It's because we're traveling quite a bit with some of the field work in communities, and so I wish I could do it sooner, but I'm just out of commission basically. Quite a bit. So I also took a screenshot here, and I just as not a joke, but I remember the cats, cults, guns, and gangs, to bring it back home to the theme and how I connected the dots for you. I asked Chad when we had already set the webinar in motion because we knew what we were going to talk about today. But when ChatGPT came out, I was like, I'm going to try it out. Let's see what it says. And it's like, yeah, it does not compute. Does not compute. There's no connection between cats and cults and guns and gangs. There's no connection. It's like, but there is. But ChatGPT, there's a connection. Here's the connection. No, you're wrong. There's no connection. So I'm like, actually, I beg to differ, but it shows you the limitations of this AI as well. So it's a good one to understand where it goes. So how might we connect the dots, right? This is my big joke, is that I tried to get Chat to do it and it couldn't do it. But hopefully I did a good job for you. And if you're wondering how you quote it, because I know sometimes people quote Google or whatever, this is an example about how you quote ChatGPT if you started using it in your work in the meantime. So look forward to that. I'll put this back up to make sure you get the info for the webinar. And yeah, let's see a couple questions. Travis, did you want to prioritize a couple questions for me?
I just put one into your chat for you.
Yeah, I got one. So great presentation, thank you. Just a quick to respond to gun and gang violence, where to start needs assessment maybe. Oh, good one. We're doing a piece of work in BC right now. I think they might actually be the first ones with their guns and gangs strategy. So number one, you don't get too far in the safety arena without talking about guns and gangs and how entwined they are with each other. But yeah, the way you would start is again with the open data, see what there is out there, because everybody's going to ask you, and everybody in the sector knows about this data. So you got to get really, really savvy with the CSI, the crime severity index, the measures involved in that. Take a look at some of the new stats coming out of the police departments in your area, and look at them nationally, but then dig into them locally. So as an example, when we look at sexual violence at a national level, it's gone up tremendously, you guys. We need to do a whole webinar just on what the heck is going on there. But it single-handedly, sexual assault increases over the last year have put up the entire CSI, the entire crime index is up. Everything is going down except for that one, and that one by itself is driving the average up. So that's one. So nationally, you need to know that that's happening, because that is obviously connected to some of these challenges that are entwined with guns and gangs, because ultimately guns and gangs are about preventative measures all the way to tertiary interventive measures as well across that continuum. So lots of connections there around victimization, discrimination, low income, looking at all those factors and doing a really nice comprehensive needs assessment, connecting the dots of the factors. And then you start shopping that out to community, to start getting the community level data, roll that up, look at the synthesis of it, and then be really nicely informed with the literature best practices before you start your deep community dialogues on this. So that's actually where one of the reasons I'm traveling is because we're doing some of that work. So I'm going to be in Langley, the two Langleys, it's the township and the city that are partnering on this together, because it's so obviously connected. And of course, you can't really talk to Langley without talking about the gang kind of life cycle and networks out of Vancouver. So we're going to be spending some time with our friends at VPD as well, their gang unit, to get the lay of the land there too. So look at it not just in your own communities. What I'm trying to say is look at it regionally as well. Bring all that data back to your community and use it as a dialogue starter. Look at best practices, look at what's been working in other communities and what might work in your community, but ultimately use the data to shape the strategy and have the right conversations and figure out what that exact metric is that you're trying to shift. So is it the recruitment metric? Is it the seizure metric, the seizure of illegal arms? What exactly is that game changer metric that you're going to build your strategy around? Because that's going to shape your mapping of these outcomes, policies, and don't forget to think about unintended consequences, of course. All right, maybe I have another Maybe I'll take one more. Informative webinar. Think outside the box. Okay, I'm glad. Data analysis is so critical. Thanks, George. Right? I agree. Thank you. Some people say data is boring, and I get lost in data analysis. It's amazing. You already know this. 47% of Indigenous children in our community live in poverty. Well, you think that's bad, Alan? I just did some work with a First Nation in Saskatchewan. 80% of 1 to 5 year olds were living in poverty in that community. But the community next door, same population size, 14,000, they're like this, they're borders, 14,000, 14,000, 80% poverty, 27% poverty. And then next time, maybe we'll get into how the money flows between those communities as well, because it's pretty self-explanatory. So data is, don't underestimate it. It's so powerful to validate your spidey senses, but also tell you something new about your community, and just be open to that, to both. And be open to being wrong and surprised by the data, but most importantly, take action on it. So that's my spiel. Thank you guys so much. How might we connect the dots on cults and cats? Hopefully that answered it for you. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you guys next time, and this was worthwhile. Thanks all. I might see some of you guys tomorrow if you're in Calgary at the Voice party at Platform Calgary as well. So if so, definitely say hello and tell me how you like the webinar as well. Thank you so much. Yes, there will be a link sent out. Get some really good comments in here as well. Yeah, everybody's gonna get the recording, etc. And yeah, awesome. We'll see you guys next time. See you later.